Chapter 0, The Harvestman. The town I live in doesn't have any graveyards. When I first moved here with my Nama, she told me that it was a perk of living here. When I asked what they did to the people that died, she said that they were fed to the Harvestman. At the time, I didn't ask what she meant. Nama is a powerful witch of a woman, and I didn't want to test her patience, especially after losing my mom and dad so recently. So, when I went to school, I asked my teacher about the Harvestman. When I asked, she immediately turned pale and said, "We don't discuss the Harvestman." Every teacher I asked said the same thing, even the principal when I was called in for disrupting the peace with my questions. When I tried explaining it to him, certain that when he knew I wasn't going to give up without an answer, he was going to give me something about the Harvestman. But still nothing. But he did threaten to suspend me if I brought it up with any of my teachers again. So, that day, during lunch, I went to my school library. I asked to see the books on local legends. But, funnily enough, they didn't have any books on local legends. When I asked to read books about monster stories and fairy tales, they didn't have those either. At this point, I asked if they had any books on mythology or legends in general. The librarian kept looking at me like I was crazy. "We don't carry any books like that here. This is a children's library," she said to me. Giving up on that, I went over the books myself in the small library. The librarian wasn't exaggerating. The books here were super simplistic picture books made for small children. Some children's books about small towns that were 30 years out of date, a few whitewashed propaganda pamphlets, history books about the early 7 cities, but nothing relevant. Most interestingly, none of the books had any supernatural element about it. And unless you count all the books with the young white male protagonist who spent his day doing whatever he wanted with no permanent consequences, beyond a talk that didn't even qualify as stern. Out of the entire small kids library, there were no stories of magic, no fairy tales, no talking animals, no scary books, and no retold tales of the Golden Touch, not even holy books or poems by Charles Dodgson. So, instead, I found myself skimming through the few books that were on the early 7 cities, even though on the outdated pages, words, paragraphs, and even entire chapters were covered with black marker. Sighing, I put the book away. It was less than useless to me. Even useless things were amusing and didn't self-censor. So I left the library, and the librarian seemed genuinely confused at why I would leave the library without checking out any books. "Do you want to read about this book about a boy finding a dog?" she said, waving a heavily redacted book about an old yellow dog. "I've read it before. I wasn't impressed the first time. Erasing the last chapter doesn't mean the boy doesn't kill his dog," I called back to her. Certainly burning that bridge, but one doesn't keep bridges to their own enemies. So I head out to the playground and went down to the far side of the park, not far from the trees that surrounded most of the town. Sitting in the grass, I looked out into the trees and I wondered what the Harvestman looked like. My first thought is that he was a psychopomp like the Albion legend of the Grim Reaper, carrying around a scythe while he harvested the bodies. Still, this didn't answer my question. My next thought was that the Harvestman was an old scarecrow brought to light by a lightning strike. Now he took the bodies away to eat them to keep his grotesque form going. After sitting and daydreaming, I gradually became aware of a boy from my class sitting next to me. Instead of playing with the other kids, he was drawing in a notebook. So I decided it would be rude not to say hi. "Hello, I'm Marceline," I told him. He nodded and said back to me, "I'm John," while he kept sketching. I looked out over the woods, lost in my thoughts, and John lost in his drawings. It was the start of our friendship. Every day at recess, I'd sit in the grass, looking at the woods, and John would sit next to me and draw the woods. At lunch, we'd sit together and eat together, waiting for the other to finish before we went out to the grass. After a few weeks, I told John my thoughts about the Harvestman, and he shared his thoughts. I heard from my parents that the Harvestman is what we become when we die. John said as he kept sketching. Wow, instead of angels and ghosts, you become a Harvestman, I said, looking out at the woods. You become a what? John asked, looking at me. You know, angels and ghosts? You've not heard of them? I asked. John shook his head in response. That lunch, I spent the entire period explaining to John the stories I've had of angels and ghosts. About how angels lived in LCO, wearing masks of perfect mirrors so they didn't blind themselves looking at the flame of the demiurge. And about how they grew many wings, eyes, and arms as a side effect from the warmth of the demiurge's flame. I told him about ghosts, souls that lingered after the body died. Usually they had unfinished business, or they wanted revenge on those that killed him. As I told John these stories, he sketched in his journal. Even though he wasn't making eye contact, I knew he was paying attention because he asked questions of what was happening in the stories. When I finished the story, he showed me what he drew. He showed a picture of someone holding a hand mirror over their face while they had many wings behind them. I smiled at this image. Well, that isn't quite what I imagined when I think of angels, but your drawing is pretty good, I told him. And this was the next step of our friendship. I told him the stories that I knew. Stories of the exiled executioner, stories of witches, stories of the novel and shapeshifters, stories of great heroes battling impossible odds, and John drew what he saw in his mind while I spoke. When I asked John about the stories his family told him, he said that his family didn't share stories like that. Only stories of camping or what plans they have for his future. Nothing close to what I had. Sadly, John didn't know why stories of fantasy or magic weren't allowed. He didn't even know that such stories existed in the first place. So he didn't know that it was gone to begin with. One day, John came to me crying that his notebook was gone. When I asked him about it, he told me that the teacher saw him drawing a gargoyle and took it away from him. This wasn't right, in my opinion. John kept saying that the teacher had to take it away. The teacher told him how dangerous it was to carry such things. That it wasn't appropriate for children because it was too dangerous for them to even think about, let alone draw. This didn't make sense, but that day, when I spoke to Nama about it, she was firmly in the teacher's favor. The people in Shepherd aren't like the people in River City. They understand that there's things they don't understand, that they'll never understand, and that it's better to never understand. That even asking such questions would lead to a very, very dangerous conclusion, Nama said while double-checking all my homework. It's a wiser philosophy if you think about it. They have their town, and the Harvestman has the woods. It's a beautiful cycle. As long as no one disturbs the cycle, then all is well. There's things normal people were never meant to know. Some knowledge is too dangerous to know, and that's why they don't need tales of magic. Even the mention of magic here is a dangerous thing. Nama finished, handing my homework to me. When I got my homework back, I looked over my Nama's many books behind her. Books on the occult, books on summoning demons, on how to conjure and curse, stories of men torn apart by their own bones, stories of people drowning in their own blood, and tales of travelers walking the paths through LCL and Pandemonium. Stories of Dungeons and Dragons were considered too much for the children, which my own grandmother seemed to agree with. Yet she carried books in her home that had to be labeled with phrases like, "This is not a place of honor," and sealed behind a lead case because it would kill anyone in the room otherwise. In my room, I tried looking up more about the Harvestman online. Shepherd was lacking in things like arcades, restaurants, libraries, and even parks. But luckily the internet here was very strong. Nothing online, sadly, about any legends of the Harvestman. The only thing I could find was information about the spider-like arachnids that people called grandfather spiders or daddy longlegs. Whatever the Harvestman was, no one spoke about it, but everyone feared it. But that fear was kind of like a void. It was like being afraid of the dark. No one knew what it was, so it could be anything. And what was in their mind scared them more than everything. So much that they couldn't shine a light in the dark. But the thing is, being scared of the dark and refusing to face it didn't make the dark go away. It only made what was in it worse than it actually was. These thoughts and many more kept me company while I tried to follow any lead I could think of. Chapter 1. John's gone. After hours with no success, I went to bed. The next day, John wasn't at school. When I asked the teacher about it, she said that John was sick. But the next day, he still didn't come back. And the next day, he still wasn't there. And by the end of the week, he still wasn't there. The teacher kept saying the same thing. John's just sick, he'll be back when he gets better. On Friday, I went to John's house. It wasn't easy to find, but John's mother was on Share My Day, and she listed her home as her work address for her essential oil business, which was apparently popular in Shepherd. It wasn't far. Everything in Shepherd was within walking distance, but walking distance didn't mean it didn't take time to find. I passed by the house twice because the number was knocked off the house. When I did find it, I went up to it and knocked on the door. There was no response, no movement, nothing inside. No car out front and no trash can on the curb. Trash day was the next day and everyone else had their trash cans out in front of their houses. So something was happening here that wasn't supposed to be happening. That realization made me feel very exposed on John's porch. I was now aware of the fact that the neighbors were staring at me. Some were staring at me from their porches or their yards. Now, very self-conscious, I quickly got off John's porch and headed to the neighbors. But suddenly the woman who was staring at me suddenly needed to go inside. When I knocked on her door, there was no response. Only a rustling of the curtains as whoever was inside was trying to hide. Not one to give up easily, I headed to another neighbor, a man who was watering his flowers. When he saw me walking towards him, he sat down his hose and went inside. The hose was still on and laying on the ground, overwatering the grass. I didn't bother knocking on his door, so nearly at a loss, I walked to the final neighbor who was still out. An old man sitting on his rocking chair. He rocked back and forth as he saw me approach. He smiled as I got close, and unlike everyone else, he didn't seem scared of me at all. He let out a sigh as he reached his hand out for me to shake it. I shook his rough hand. As I shook his hand, I saw that his eyes were golden and he seemed older in his eyes than he looked. The best example I could give is the Appalachian Mountains. They were small for the mountains, but they were very old. And if you get close enough to them, you'll realize they're actually older than the dinosaurs, older than the trees, and even older than bones. With that age came an experience that I could only dream of. Not immortality, but one who had seen many changes, and would see many more even as they see their end coming. "Hi there, little miss. Are you looking for the Joneses? I'm afraid they moved out this Monday," the old man told me. "They did? Did John go with him?" I asked him. Now, I was sad. My friend may have been gone forever if he moved away. John? Sweet little boy? He loved drawing whatever he saw in his mind's eye? No, he didn't move out with his parents. His parents moved because of him. The old man saw the confused look on my face, so he explained while I stood. This town didn't always have the Harvestman. Once we were a normal town. We even had a graveyard before it was taken by the woods. Once. But soon after Lady Pierce, your grandmother, moved into town, something started digging up the graves. She told us it was the Harvestman stealing our dead, and if we didn't give up our wicked ways, they'd go after the living next. The old man sighed before he said the next part. At first, we figured she had to have been wrong. The sheriff at the time went into the woods. When he went in, he came back barely able to stand, and still people died in town. He said that he killed it, but still, people were vanishing. It actually felt like it was happening more often now. Lady Pierce told us that if the Harvestman didn't let anyone go, and if the sheriff wasn't given to the woods, then we would all die. The old man looked out in the woods. He seemed even more lost than he was before, lost in a memory long past. I was just a boy then, so I didn't know what my parents were doing, and I didn't know why they went out with a rope when my big sister vanished. All I knew at the time was they came back bloody that night, and the last person to vanish in our town was the sheriff. Looking back at it now, the old man took a deep breath. I think my parents tied up the sheriff and surrendered him to the woods. After that night, Lady Pierce gave our town rules. No discussion of magic. Magic would draw its attention. We couldn't talk about the Harvestman because that would also bring it in. And our final rule was we had to bring our dead to the forest for the Harvestman to feed. The old man closed his eyes and leaned back. It wasn't enough to just not talk about magic. All the books that even hinted at magic had to be destroyed. All of them had to be gathered into town square and burned. My little prayer book was thrown into the pile by my parents. Even my sister's journal, all that was left of her, was thrown into the pyre, because she wrote about meeting fairies in the woods. The old man looked down at his hands. Now I could see that there are old burn scars on them. The scars were years old, or even decades old, but I didn't notice when I shook his hand when I was entranced by his eyes. I reached into the pyre for my sister's journal. I burned my hands, and all I could get was a single page with only my sister's name on it. A fragment of my sister. All that was left of her, and even that was too much, according to Lady Pierce. My own parents tore my hand open and threw it into the pyre. The old man sighed yet again. After that night, my parents never spoke about my sister again. They removed the knob to her door. They nailed the door shut. Whenever I tried to talk about her, they'd either shush me or smack me. Even her name was forbidden in our household. Apparently, they feared the Harvestman so much that we weren't even allowed to mourn her. That would have given it too much recognition. What happened to John? He talked about the Harvestman, and of angels, and of spirits. Things I've not heard spoken out loud in over 40 years. The Joneses were once good people, but in fear they asked your grandmother for help. Can you guess what she told them? He asked me. I responded by shaking my head. His story was riveting, but I couldn't imagine what Nama told them to do. She wasn't always the nicest woman, and with what happened with my parents, but that was different. Surely she couldn't do to the same thing to people that were her friends. Mom and Dad were one thing to sacrifice, but surely Nama wouldn't hurt someone else who was asking for help, right? She told the Joneses that they would need to leave Shepherd, and that they would need to feed John to the Harvestman. They left on Monday, and I believe that John had been in the woods this entire time. The ground felt like it was spinning. I couldn't focus on standing when I realized that John may have been eaten by that thing. Grabbing at the banister at the edge of the porch, I caught my breath while the old man waited patiently. But I don't think that John is gone for good. I can't go into the woods myself, but I do think that there is still hope. I asked a friend for help. They'll be coming by tomorrow, and I want you to help guide them through the woods. the old man said. He took a business card from his pocket. On one side was a shielded email address, but the first side had a name and a title. Hunter Michikoto, I read out loud, and the old man nodded. That's right. I took care of the payment, but I'd love your help, little Marceline, he told me. I looked up at him and asked the obvious question. How do you know my name, and why are you telling me all this? Aren't you scared of the Harvestman? I asked. The old man chuckled while he rubbed at his eyes, like there was something in his eyes. After he looked at me again, the gold in his eyes faded some. I'm done trying to hide from what I don't understand, and I'm done making my grandson pay for my parents' choices. He talked about you so much, you know. You were his best friend in the world, and I'm telling you all this because I've been scared for so long. Even when I saw my son and his wife take away my only grandson, I was too scared to speak up. Not anymore. If the Harvestman is going to eat me over this, that's fine. As long as it isn't John, Mr. Jones told me. Chapter 2. Michikoto. When I made it home, I emailed Michikoto and explained to him what I knew about the situation. He seemed oddly calm over the email, and he didn't seem upset that he was talking to a 10-year-old who was going to be his guide. I wasn't too worried about being caught by Nama. She didn't believe in using computers, and she was out of town for the weekend. So, as long as I was careful, she wouldn't find out. But still, I knew in my heart she could never find out. So, that next day, I headed to the small diner in town. The old waitress and cook were husband and wife who both owned and worked at the diner. Despite all their tender love and care, it was still run down. A jukebox that hadn't been updated in 40 years, red leather seats that had seen every fluid in human history splashed across it, and a menu that the only thing that had changed on it since 2700 was the prices. In any other town or city, this place would be called nostalgic, or possibly even retro. But here in Shepherd, it was the only diner in town. I had a printout of the email from Michikoto that told me to meet him and his team at this diner. Sure enough, at the counter sat 3 adults. A man in a leather jacket and long hair with no hair tie. Next to him was a woman who was almost as tall as he was. She didn't wear leather, but she had just as much presence as if she did. And finally, on the other side of the woman was a yawning man who was drinking coffee and already asking for a refill. But what made all of them stand out most to me was the fact that on their backs was a shield symbol, or a heater, with antlers on top of it. A symbol I've not seen before, but everyone knew that the heater was a symbol of heroes. Heroes were something that a town as small as Shepherd had never seen up close at all. The waitress was staring at them while she pretended to do an inventory of straws and peppermint candies. Pulling up my hoodie, I sat next to the man with the long hair and whispered to him, "Are you Michikoto?" The man chuckled and fake whispered back, "Yes, but you can call me Mitch. This is my wife Sochi and my cousin Marcus. Also, why are we whispering?" he said to me. I don't know. In the movies, that's how it always worked. That way we don't draw attention to ourselves, I whispered to him. Mitch laughed again. We're the only ones here. The waitress is being more subtle than you are. Speaking of which, can we get a menu for our friend here? Michikoto said, waving the waitress over. She gave me a cup of water, a kid's menu, and even a box of crayons. Looking at the menu, I felt my stomach drop. Even the cheapest kids' menu item was more than I could afford. I didn't have an allowance, no job, and no centie to my name. I felt a gentle hand on my arm. Somehow, Sochi was at my other side now, laying an adult menu next to me. Here, we got this for you. You're our guest, she said, her hand lifted up to my hood as she gently removed it. You draw less suspicion when you're not hiding, and when you're drawing just the right kind of attention, you can fit in anywhere, she told me. I don't know why, but she reminded me of my mother. I heard a loud yawn down where Marcus was sitting. He sighed as he said, I don't care what's on the menu, as long as you keep drawing me this amazing coffee, he said to the waitress, causing her to have a rare smile while she topped off his coffee. So, tell us everything, Michikoto said after everyone placed their order with the waitress. I explained everything to them, at least as far as I understood it, and when the food arrived, I was still explaining. As we ate, Michikoto, Sochi, and Marcus discussed their strategy. A lot of words I didn't understand, such as scavenger, necrophage, and scouring salt. After breakfast was done, Marcus left a denarius on the counter. First, the waitress tried to refuse it, saying she couldn't break 100, but Marcus shook his head. I'm not asking for you to break it, no change. The rest of that is your tip, he explained. Suddenly, she was thanking us profusely while we left. While we walked out to the woods, they explained that I would be waiting out in the van with Marcus, while Sochi and Michikoto went to the woods to find John. At the van, Michikoto picked up a crossbow with black tips on the bolts. Somehow it carried 13 bolts on it. Strapping the crossbow to his back, he also picked up a portable radio. Sochi picked up a backpack that looked like it belonged on the trail. The two of them prepared, they started to go into the woods. Sochi led the way, staring at the ground while she led them both. While they walked into the woods, I struck up a conversation with Marcus. We talked about legendary creatures, those that we heard or even saw. Anything to keep my mind off of John, who was somewhere in these woods. Chapter 3. The Woods. Michikoto's Perspective. Sochi led us both into the woods. She saw the trail that should have been faded by this point, but she was still able to see it. Somehow she was able to see all the little details that were left behind. Marcus called it thin slicing, where someone would notice details that most people would ignore but draw an accurate conclusion. While I was certain that was at least partially the case, I was also certain that there was much more to it. I've tracked all sorts of things. I've tracked snowmen through the Antarctic desert, narwhal through the Yucatan jungle, and even kraken through the Aegean Sea. So, finding small details that would lead to the beast is something I'm used to. And although I could see many deep holes in the forest floor, I couldn't see whatever my wife was following. She called it her second sight. She was able to follow and see things that others would never see, details that she couldn't possibly know. What do you think of Marceline? I asked her while we went deeper and deeper into the woods. There's something special about her, Sochi said, focused mostly on the hunt. Something special? She's like you? I asked her. She's not like me, but she's not unlike me. She's esoteric, for sure. But she's not sure what she is. She's as unyielding and as ephemeral as a howling moon, Sochi explained to me while we wandered. Her eyes glazed over. Honey? I asked her. She stood stock still. Waving my hand in front of her eyes, she still didn't move. Thinking it might be a petite mal seizure, I did a quick test. Sweetheart, does the black moon howl? I asked her. When the last word came out of my mouth, her eyes focused on me again. Never when she's alone, she whispered back to me. What happened to you? I asked her. She pointed to an opening in a cliff face behind some bushes. He was dragged through there. The Harvestman carried him, Sochi whispered to me. Any idea what kind of monster this is? Is it a spirit, a fae, a demon, or a deity? I asked. My crossbow was an Olympian-class weapon. Spirits and fays were simple enough to deal with. Demons and deities were difficult, but technically possible with my crossbow. It would still be vital to know. No, nothing like that. I know John is more scared now than he's ever been in his life. The Harvestman has 8 legs and 2 eyes. It grabbed John with its pincers, and John could see the mouth mere inches from his face. The Harvestman is a fully physical foe. I know that, Sochi told me. I hugged her close as when she spoke her final words before she hugged me back. She was feeling everything John felt to give us this information. And even with adult courage and experience, she wasn't viewing his pain with those walls up. She was viewing it all with the pain of the fresh eyes of someone who didn't know if they were going to live or die, with no experience on how to cope. In moments like this, my hugs helped keep her centered. After a moment, she hugged me back. I'm certain John is in that cave, and I'm certain it's not going to stay that way long. We need to get him out, she said to me. I nodded and we walked to the cave. It wasn't deep, as caves go. Maybe 10 feet inside. Already I could see John. He was laying on the ground, a leg clearly broken, and passed out from pain and hunger. While Sochi checked on him, I pulled out my crossbow. Whatever the Harvestman was, it wouldn't leave a living meal behind for very long. We need to go, I told Sochi while she picked up John. I heard a rustling noise behind us in the bushes, and I turned to face the noise with my crossbow in hand when I faced the Harvestman. When I saw the Harvestman, I finally understood why he was called the Harvestman. It wasn't too tall. His legs were as long as I was tall, and about as thick as a tree branch. A translucent brown where you could see fluids pumping through its many legs. Its central body was a familiar orange-brown bean shape, about the same size as John's body, maybe a little bigger. It had 8 legs and 2 eyes. The eyes were black as can be and focused on me. And before its eyes was all too disgusting orange salivating jaws with 2 peldopaps, which were like finger-like graspers, that looked like it belonged to a scorpion, only it was way undersized. The peldopaps rubbed together, producing a chattering noise. It sounded like a cross of birdsong and branches rubbing together. Fine, almost invisible brown hairs covered its body, thickest on its underside. The entire creature, it smelled of rot, and it smelled like it crawled out of a graveyard. The discolored meat that dropped from its peldopaps told me that it may have very well have recently dug up a graveyard. I was truly glad that John passed out at this time, before he could face something like that. Even with what I faced before, there was something terrifying about staring at something that shouldn't exist so close to its face. It truly was a giant Harvestman, an arachnid that was commonly called a daddy longleg. This one was far larger than it had any right to be. And although I haven't seen anything like this before, I was still familiar with giant arthropods. Primeval was full of them, usually in the forms of spiders, scorpions, crabs, and ants. Still though, giant arthropods usually followed similar behavior to their smaller counterparts. What I knew about daddy longlegs came to mind while I faced this arachnid abomination. Omnivorous, ambush predator, usually a scavenger, occasionally moves in groups, and opportunistic cannibal. They can consume whole chunks of food, not just liquids. They don't possess fangs, venom, nor silk. but they will attack something larger themselves if desperate. Whatever you do, don't act like prey, I whispered to Sochi. I then stood as high as I could, looking into its unblinking eyes. Back off, I yelled with my chest. The cave added an echo to my words. The noise caused the arachnid to back off some. I kept taking steps forward, my crossbow pointing towards it. Does the black moon howl? I called out again. The loud noise brought it completely out of the cave, but it served as a secondary action. If it could understand me, it would have to respond to me. I don't like killing things, and if the Harvestman could understand me, it could be reasoned with. Go! I yell at Sochi, noticing her running out of the woods with John on her back. While she was carrying John, the Harvestman turned its body, eyes following Sochi, clearly still after its prey. My wife at risk, I threw scouring salt from my pocket at its eyes. I would not let this monster hurt her nor John. My distaste of killing now overridden by the fact I didn't respond, and my farther greater distaste of someone being eaten on my watch. I'm your threat, I yelled at it, making myself seem as big as possible while I bounced at my knees. A trick I knew that was sometimes used by insects to make them harder to focus on. It broke up silhouettes and made it harder for something with weak eyesight to focus on you. Unfortunately, it seemed the Harvestman was used to creatures trying to bounce. The Harvestman hissed and then leapt towards me, fluid dripping from its palps that moved way too much like fingers for me to ignore. I loosed an obsidian bolt at the jumping arachnid. I missed the vitals, but I managed to tear away one of its palps, and it bled a clear fluid from its wounds. But the hair on its legs managed to slash at my arm. It cut the leather and scratched my skin. Even barely touching it, it was still sharper than steel, and even without venom I could feel the sting. And this creature was covered in these nearly invisible spears. So I couldn't get too close nor touch it without it slicing me into ribbons. But this creature was also clearly willing to jump on me. So clearly this was going to be a fight, not a flight nor a freeze. Alt Vite, I cursed from the pain. But the Harvestman was now focused on me. I ran towards a clearing in the opposite direction from where Sochi ran, careful to be quick and unpredictable in my movements, constantly moving up and down to break my silhouette. It was a lot like a dance, but a dance where the audience would kill you if you misstepped and fell. And sure enough, the Harvestman saw me as a larger target priority than it saw Sochi or John as food. Perfect. I've always wanted to be bait, as long as it kept her safe. In the clearing, I faced the Harvestman. It entered from the woods facing me, its legs bent as it prepared another jump. As it readied its next jump, I readied my next bolt. I fired just as it leapt. My bolt flew true while it flew through the air. I watched as the bolt flew between its eyes and exit from its thorax. Its screech when it was shot immediately brought a headache to me. Its body falling towards me, I took a step aside, letting the body fall down on the ground. Even with the bolt through the body, the Harvestman refused to die. As its legs twitched, and it dragged itself towards me. You want to keep going? I tell it, taking a step forward, until I stopped. I saw what else awaited me at the edge of the woods, what made me pause and decide to step away from the Harvestman. It wasn't a unique creature. Dozens of Harvestmen stood at the edge of the woods, all with unblinking eyes staring at what I did. My crossbow only had 11 more bolts before I needed to reload, and even if all my bolts were single-shot kills, I didn't have enough bolts for everyone. For a moment, I considered what I should do, until I realized that all the eyes weren't focused on me. They were focused on the hurt Harvestman at my feet. Then I remembered another fact about Daddy Longlegs. "You're all opportunistic cannibals, aren't you?" I say while backing away from the body. And sure enough, the Harvestmen approached. When I took a step back, they took a step forward. They wanted their meal, but they also saw what I did, and they didn't want that. Keeping my crossbow out, I took steps back carefully to keep facing the Harvestmen. Once they made it to the dying Harvestman, they were no longer interested in me. I ran out of the woods before I saw how they tore the Harvestman open while it was still alive. I didn't need to see how it would be ripped apart by its own kind. I did hear the screaming, even after I left the woods. It sounded all too human, but I knew better to look back or to try and help what had tried to kill me. Finally, out of the woods, I saw everyone was safe at the van. Seeing Sochi safe, still with John, Marcus calling Vanguard to help John with his injuries, and Marceline was busy talking with her friend who had recently woke up, both of them distracting each other from what had happened. When Sochi saw me, she ran up to me and hugged me when I was finally safely out of the woods. I heard the scream. I thought you were hurt," Sochi said while she hugged me close. "Please, you know my scream's better than that," I told her, enjoying our moment together before we had to deal with the complicated process of cleaning up. Epilogue. Once John's grandfather heard of his grandson's return, he joined John in the hospital in River City. With no reason to stay in Shepherd anymore, John and his grandfather moved on with their lives, careful not to let Marceline's grandmother know that he had escaped. John revealed to both the hunters and to Marceline that the Harvestman didn't break his legs. His parents did, and left him in the woods, confident the Harvestman would find him. And it did. He survived that time, eating what he could find crawling nearby and drinking what water dripped in the cave. He didn't think he would have been found again, but he was glad to have seen his friend again. John's parents were never found again. They never wanted to be found, and no one wanted to find them. Marceline wrote many notes of the Harvestman and the fact that there were many in the woods, kept in her personal journal. Once he lost her friend, she decided to keep her stories to herself. But she did write what she knew and what she needed to know. Her curiosity of the supernatural world around her only grew since meeting the hunters. Her Nama slept well those nights, convinced that the town she lived in was still under her firm control, where they feared the unknown, believing that all that was magical and strange were threats too great to even think about, giving her the firmest control because she was the only one that would deal with it. She was unaware of the fact that within her own home, curiosity was growing. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a good rest of your night, and thank you.